Welcome back, friends. My name is Dan Vega, and I'm a developer advocate on the Spring team. In today's tutorial, I get to talk to you about two of my favorite things in the world right now, and that is Spring and Notion. So if you've been around this channel for a while, you're probably already familiar with what Spring is, but you may not know what Notion is. So Notion is this really great tool that I use. It's kind of like a workspace that allows you to store data. Think like Airtables meets Excel. And I use Notion to pretty much track everything in my life. So let's talk about like the videos that I create for this channel. I have this nice Kanban board where I have things like that are just simple ideas. Like maybe I want to do a video on this, and then I refine it and start to put more details into that idea. And then I have different columns like, hey, ready to film, film, editing, publishing, published, etc. So I use that to track videos. I also write a newsletter. I use Notion to kind of keep track of that. So every week I publish a new newsletter throughout the week. I'll throw clips or links or notes in there. And then towards the end of the week on Thursday and Friday, I will write out that newsletter in Notion, export it out as Markdown, and upload that to my blog and use that Markdown as well in my email marketing software ConvertKit. So there are so many uses for it. I also use it as maybe a reading list. What books am I currently reading? Which books do I want to read? I like to try to retain some of the information that I'm reading. So I use that as a way to kind of keep notes on some of that stuff. And one of the other things that I'm doing lately is I have a list of public speaking events in Notion. So this could be a talk at a virtual conference or a live stream or an in-person conference. But what I want to do is use Notion to kind of keep track of that. And now with the Notion API, I can extract that information into other applications, say on my website, and display that information. So that's the basis for what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at this talks database that I've created with just a list of events that I'll be speaking at. And what we'll do is we'll use the Notion API to connect to that and pull that information and display it in a REST API in Spring. So what we're doing today is really just the tip of the iceberg, but it's kind of the 101 fundamentals that we need. I'm really excited for this tutorial, really the foundation for building a bunch of things that we can do later on. And I'm really excited to see, how you like this tutorial and really what comes next. So what are we waiting for? Let's write some code. What you are looking at is the database that we're going to use to kind of drive this application in this tutorial. This is a list of talks, or whether they're in person or virtually, just a list of speaking engagements that I can keep track of. And then I want to go ahead and pull that into an application and be able to display that. So if you're not familiar with Notion, don't worry about it. Just think of Notion, at least in this case, everything revolves around a database. A database could be like an Excel spreadsheet or an Airtable, kind of, on full strength. It could do a lot more than that, but this is the main idea: is we have this database and then we can create different views of it if we want to. So I have some columns, if you will. So a title, what is the type, a start date and an end date, where the talk is. So for everything online, that's just virtually. We have some tags. What are the kind of things that we're going to be talking about? There's a URL for either the event or the conference. And then there's a recording if there is one available. So this is the idea. We have a bunch of data here. We don't want to manage it in two places. We want to just manage it here in Notion, and we want to pull it into our application. All right, once you have your database set up, you need to go over to developers.notion.com, and this is where you can find out more about the API. So if you've never used the API before, probably suggest stopping this and just taking a look at the documentation. So there's some getting started information. If you go in here and getting started, here's our API documentation, which is going to be important. There's a JavaScript client. We're not using JavaScript, obviously, but if you move over to JavaScript, this is very handy. And this is actually going to be what I'm using to kind of mimic some of the calls I'm making. At the end of the day, I think I want to make a Java client, or at least a Spring Boot starter, where we can kind of mimic the functionality in the Notion SDK for JavaScript. And there's no reason to mimic that. It's just I use it a lot, so I might as well make it consistent. So if I'm jumping back and forth between languages, I can go ahead and use it. There's also a Postman collection. So if you use Postman, this is very handy. You just download this and you got all those calls right there in Postman without having to set those up. All right, so before we look at any of the documentation, the first thing you need to do is go over to View My Integrations. And this is really where you're going to set up the integration, because just creating this database here in Notion, this Talks database, doesn't mean that it's available to anything outside of Notion. You need to come in and create a new integration here. You'll give it a name. You can have the associated workspace, and then you need to say what the capabilities are. In our case, we're only going to be reading. I've done some other videos in JavaScript where I was updating and reading. So you'd want to just, it depends on what your application is going to do, but we're just going to read in this case. From the user, I don't need any user information. I'm going to go ahead and submit. We'll just call this test. And we'll submit this. And then what comes back is this API token. And this is going to be one of the secrets that we're going to capture. So again, don't share this with anybody. I'm not going to share this with you. But once you have this set up, I have this set up for this. This is danvega.dev talks, or I think it's one of these. We'll find out in a second. Once this is set up, there's still one more step. You got to go back over to the database and you need to go to share. And you can see that it has danvega.dev talks down here. This is that integration I set up. So you need to make sure you come in here and share this with the integration that you set up. Once those two things are in place, you are ready to go. All right, so now we've seen the database that we're going to use. We've seen how to set up the integration. The next step is to really come in here and take a look at the API documentation. So there's a lot of things you can do within Notion. There's a lot of information you can get out of Notion. All we are really worried about is the database and what's inside of there. So each of the rows. So you'll see in here there's things like retrieve a database. So a retrieve a database, all this actually does is get you the database itself. It doesn't get you the actual rows. But if you needed to kind of look at the database and look at some information about the database, this is what you would need, but we're not going to use that. What you actually need to do is query a database. And so if you look at this post here, this is a post request. You can see it goes to api.notion.com v1/database and then the database ID /query. So that's important. It's /query. But that database ID, what is that? So if we go back here, if you look in this URL here, this is actually the database, everything before that question mark. So this is the database ID, not that very secret, very public. If you gave this to someone, it's not a big deal. They can't do anything with it. So we need that database ID. So what I want to do is, again, we're not using JavaScript, but there's some nice documentation for the SDK for JavaScript here. There's just some information in here of like, hey, if you wanted to query this database, you can actually get a list of pages, you can do some filtering. We don't have a lot of data here, so we're just going to get everything. But what I want to do is actually jump over to Postman and take a look at an example of making a request to this and see what the information is that we're going to get back. Okay, so here I am in Postman, and you can see I have that URL, the api.notion.com v1/databases. Here's my database ID and then query. So again, this is a post request. You'll need to set up the authorization. It will be a bearer token with that secret that we grabbed from the My Integrations page. Under headers, you need two headers here. The Notion version, again, this is in the document, the API documentation, so nothing secret here. You need Notion-version. This is the current version of the API, and then the content type, which is application/JSON. With all this in place, we should be able to go ahead and make a post request, and we can. And what we get back is a list of results. So the results, if we come down here and we kind of do this and this and this, so let's do this a few times, you can start to see that these are each of the results in our table, in our database that we created before. So really it has a next cursor and it has more, and then all it has here is the results array, which is a list of pages. So before we get into writing code, it's important to understand that this thing is considered a database. So we'll kind of model that in our application. And then each of these results are considered a page. you can see that in page. And if you go back to the API docs, that's what they'll refer to it as well as a page. So a page has some information about it. It has an ID, when it was created, who created it. There are things like cover and icons, but then this is really what you care about. So each row in that database is a page, and each row in that database has a set of properties. Now this is going to be very dynamic. If we were to go ahead and add a column to that talks database, it would show up here under properties. So properties is an object, and inside of properties, each of these objects are, or each of these columns are objects that have different fields on them. Now, because Notion is so customizable and you can do so many things with it, you're going to see that the data that comes back is often convoluted. There's a whole bunch of information that comes back. So it's going to make our job a little tricky when we go into Spring and try to model these two things, the database and the page, but we will do it. So properties is dynamic, and then in here you have all the different columns, right? There's a URL. Here's the actual URL. There's a type. That is a select in Notion where we're going to pick just one. The name of that one is conference. You can see we have things like location, recording, start date, end date, tags. So this is a multi-selector. You give you all the tags in there. And each of those have different properties, but the name is all we really care about there. And then the title is kind of the primary key in that database. So it has a title. The reason I want you to do this first is to get familiar with the data that you're going to be working with, because it's not as simple as saying, okay, I got a page, give me the title. That's not it. You can see that the way that we have to traverse this data is page.title.text.content. So, and then if you wanted any of these other attributes, like is it bold, does it have a color, then you would have to pull those as well. We're not going to here, but again, just a lot of data that comes back, and it's important to play around with it here first before you go into code and try and model that same behavior. So I think that's where we'll leave this. We understand the Notion database, the API integrations, the API documentation, and then specifically this call to get back a database with all the rows in it. So with that, I think we can go in and create our Spring Boot app and begin putting this all together. To get started, we're going to head over to start.spring.io. We're going to choose a Maven project. We're using Java today. The current stable version of Spring Boot at the time of this recording is 2.6.4. We're going to go ahead and have a group of dev.danvega. We'll call this artifact Notion Talks. And I think that we're going to choose Java 17. And the only dependencies that we're going to need today are web and the configuration processor. So I think that's all we're going to need. Let's go ahead and generate that project. I will download that and open that up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ. The very first thing we need to do is set up some configuration. So in my application.properties, I want to be able to add some information for the different properties that we're going to store in this application. So things like the API URL, the API version. Remember that database ID that we talked about before, and something like the API Notion key, right? So all of these things we got to set up. So to have those stored in application.properties, we need to create a configuration properties file. So that's the first thing I want to do is I want to come in here and set up a package. We're going to call this config. I'm going to create a new record called Notion config properties. So this is going to be a record. And what we're going to store in here is the API URL, the API version, the auth token, and the database ID. Okay, so we set those up. We're going to go ahead and mark this with add configuration properties. We're going to give it a prefix of Notion. So then basically, if we want to set an API URL, that's going to be notion.api-URL. So we set that up. It's going to complain to us and say, hey, you haven't marked anything to enable configuration properties yet. So if we go in our main application class and enable configuration properties, and we'll do it just for that one. That class. Okay, so that should make everything look okay. So now what we can do is we can come into our application.properties and we can say Notion, but of course we did not build yet, so we don't have that metadata yet. So if you ever run across this issue and hey, I should have a key called Notion API key, and that's not showing up yet. It's because we don't have a target folder here, and that target folder is what contains that metadata. So let's just do a quick build. And then we should see that target folder come in. And if you look under classes and meta-inf, you should see the metadata. And this contains all of the information about the configuration properties that we set up. So now we can come in here and say Notion.api URL, and this is going to be api.notion.com. We can set up an API version. So remember back in Postman, we had to use that API version. This is that same thing. So we're going to say 0816. And then we're going to go ahead and set up a database ID. So let me go ahead and grab this from another screen. This again is that database ID and the URL for the Talks database that I set up. So these are the three things that I want here. Now, what I also have is something called the auth token, but this is a secret that I do not want to share. I do not want to publish this out to Git so that other people can see it. I've actually done a whole video around what we're about to talk about, which is importing additional configuration. So I'll leave a link below to that if you want to kind of stop and watch that. But what we are going to do here is we are going to say, hey, I want to bring in a new file here. I want to say spring.config.import, and this is going to be optional. So if it's not around, it's not going to break our build, but our application will not work without that auth token, right? So what I'm saying here is I'm going to create a new file in here, and we're going to call this secret.properties. Actually, I do want to call this secrets. There could be more than one. So we'll see secrets.properties, and back in here, we're going to fix that. And then in here, I'm going to have something called the notion.auth. So we're not going to get suggestions in here. And this is where I'm going to put my secret. So I'm at some point after we're done talking about this, I'm going to go ahead and put this in here. And then what we can do is come in here to our git ignore and say, hey, that file, that secrets.properties, I do not want you to go ahead and commit that to Git. So now we have just that auth token on my machine. It won't get committed over to our repository. So I'm going to fill this in, and then we'll move on to the next step. The first thing I'm going to work on here is the code that we're going to use to talk to the Notion API. And so I did make a mistake here. I want to actually refactor this out. I'm going to have a new package in here called Notion. And this is where all of my Notion code is going to sit. So I'm going to refactor that config into there because this is specific to that. So I have notion.config. So I also want a notion.service. So I'm going to create a new package in here called service. All right, so again, this is all the code. What we'll probably end up doing at some point is extracting all of this Notion code out and into its own library. But for now, I just want to keep this simple. And so it's all going to just live under this Notion package. So the first thing that we need is a new class called database service. So this database service is going to be responsible for talking to the Notion API and getting a list of getting that database back with all of the pages. So this, because we're going to be in here, what I want to do is before we actually work on this, we should probably start talking about the model, right? So let's go ahead and create a new package, and we'll call this model. And inside of here, we're going to create a new class called database. So again, remember that this isn't a database like a database connection like to a MySQL database. This is the idea of that database in Notion. So we're really just trying to model what a database looks like after the object that was in Postman. So let's jump back to Postman real quick. And if you remember, that particular object or that particular database had this object key, the results key, a next cursor, and it has more. So it didn't have a lot here, but that results is basically that list of pages. So let's first model that database. So the database is going to have something called a private string object. It's going to have a list of something called a page. We'll get to that in a minute, called pages, and that will be in a new array list. Next, we'll have that next cursor. So private Boolean next cursor. And then we have that private Boolean has more. So those are our fields that we're going to have. Now these don't exactly line up, right? That thing was called results in the JSON that was coming back, not pages, but we can quickly fix that. We can say, hey, that JSON property is something called results. Again, page is not defined yet. We'll get to that in a second. There's a JSON property called next cursor. And then there is a JSON property called has more. Oops, no, that is has more. Okay, so that's really all there is for that. Now we just need some getters and setters for everything. So getters and setters for each of those. And then we'll create a toString. And that should be that. Okay, now we need to go ahead and create this page object. So let's go ahead and create class page inside of model. So now we have a page. And the page, if we go back to Postman, is going to be each of these inside of here. So a page is going to have things like object, ID, created time, last edited time, created by, last edited by. Now we don't need to specifically have all of those if we're not using them. Things like cover and icon we probably won't use, but the big one is going to be this properties. So remember that properties is a dynamic list of those columns that's coming back. So let's go ahead and try and set this up. So we're going to need a string object. We're going to need an ID. We're going to need the local date time for created time. Again, this JSON property is a little bit different. It looked like created underscore time. We're going to need a local date time for the last edited time. Again, JSON property. I'm not even sure if I'm going to use those, but I'm just going to grab them for the heck of it for now. So Boolean archived private string URL private. Now here is where this gets fun, right? So the properties is really like an object that's coming back, but it's also dynamic. So how do we here in our page model describe that properties object that can be very dynamic? It contains a bunch of dynamic information. Well, one way in Jackson is we can use something called a JSON node. And what that will allow us to do is use methods like get by its key name to go ahead and get information out of that dynamic node. So if you jump into JSON node, base class for all JSON nodes, which from the basis of JSON tree model, Jackson implements. One way to think of these nodes is to consider them similar to DOM nodes in an XML DOM. So you can always just kind of traverse an XML DOM tree and get information that you want. So that is all of the properties for the page. Let's go ahead and create some getters and setters for this. And we'll create a toString. Now toString, I don't want to include, well, yeah, I guess I don't care for now. That's okay. Okay, cool. that looks good, except this. Okay, that does look good. Cool. So now we have our model. We have our database, which has a list of pages. And then each of those pages are defined like this with a dynamic JSON node of different properties. So now that we have our database and our page set up, we can start to create our database service to access the Notion API and pull this information back. All right, I'm gonna head back to my database service here, and let's think about what we need to do here. So the first thing that I'm gonna go ahead and add is a logger, just so I have something to do some logging with. And this is gonna be a logger factory dot get logger, and this will be database service dot class. So now I have a logger. The first thing that I'm gonna want is a list of pages. So I want a list of pages, and I'll call this query. The reason I'm calling this query is the same as that API. And again, as we get through this, you'll start to see that I am trying to kind of mimic that Notion SDK for JavaScript. So this is called query in there, and so we'll call it query. So this is going to take a database ID because you don't want to hard code this. This can be very dynamic, so we can use this for any database that we're going to query. So to do so, the first thing that I would need is let's go ahead and return now. First thing that I need is a URL for the Notion API. To do so, I'm going to use that Notion configuration properties. So I'm going to go ahead and say, so we'll create a private final Notion config props, and we'll call this Notion config props. And so to get that into this class, we'll use a constructor parameter. We're using constructor injection here to get in the Notion configuration. So then all I got to say here is Notion config props dot API URL. So we're going to say, give me that base API URL slash v1 slash databases. And then the database ID. So that is going to be passed into this method. And then finally slash query. So that's our URL that we're going to call. So let's just go ahead and log something there. I'm going to go ahead and log info. We'll say querying Notion database. And then we'll just say the URL just to make sure that we have the correct URL there. So the next thing that we're going to need is we're going to need a REST template. We're here in Spring MVC. We're going to need a way to call out to the Notion API. So in Spring MVC here, we're going to use the REST template. So I need an instance of the REST template. I'll probably use this again. So let me just come into config. Let me create a new Java class called Notion config for all of our kind of Notion configuration. So I'm going to say configuration. And then in here, I'm just going to say, give me a bean REST template, and return to me a new REST template. So now this will make it available for dependency injection. So now what I can do is come in here and say private final REST template. And we'll say, let's add that as a constructor parameter. So now I can go ahead and use my REST template in here. I'm going to say REST template.exchange. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be calling the URL that we just set up. We are going to be calling a post method, right? So we make sure that's a post. The next argument is the HTTP entity. And this is actually going to have some headers. So let's go ahead and extract this into a method. We'll call this get this default headers. We might use that again. So this is actually going to bring back the HTTP headers. What do we need in here? So let's say headers. Let's go to new headers. So we have that instance, and now we're going to say headers.set. The first thing we want to set is the content type. That's going to be application/JSON. The next thing we want to set is the Notion. So this is the Notion version. So again, remember, this is it. We use this in Postman. We also set up a configuration property for this. So we can just ask our config props for the Notion versions, the API version, sorry. And then we also want to we want to go ahead and set authorization. So this is going to be that auth token that we got. So auth token. So again, this is the one that's sitting in this secret step properties. Notion-version, that looks correct. Yep, I don't know why it's complaining, but oh, it's an unknown header. That's true. This is definitely a header that's specific to Notion. Okay, so now that gets back. The only other thing we need here is, we need to say what we're going to be returning back. And what we're going to get back is that database that we set up, an instance of that. So that should be all we need. Let's go ahead and set up a local variable here. We're going to call this DB. So that's going to bring back a response entity. So once that comes back, now we just need to get the actual body, and then what we're actually going to return is a list of pages, remember. So if we just got the body, we'd be returning the database. So if we said db.getBody, that's going to return just that database. What we actually want is that list of pages. So in this case, I just want to get the list of pages. I could set up a method here to get the database, and then from the database I can call like get pages. But in this instance, hey, I just want the rows. I want the data, and I want to be able to work with that data. So that's what I'm going to do here. I think this class looks good. Yeah, so I think the database service looks good. Oh, we do have an error going on here. What is this complaining about? Oh, we did not return anything. Thank you, IntelliJ. That might help. Okay, so yeah, I think this database service looks good. Let's move on to the next step. All right, to close this out, we're going to need one more class in our Notion package. So we're going to go ahead and create a new class, and we're going to call this the Notion client. Again, just trying to mimic what we do on the JavaScript side. So now I just want to make a quick note too, that going throughout this process, I would be writing tests for this. If we did this the way that I would write this would be probably a 2-hour long video. So I'm trying to condense this as much as possible, but just know all the stuff that we're doing here in this Notion package, the way that we can confirm that everything that we're doing is correct is through writing tests. And so that's what you should be doing. That's what you can be doing. And we'll get those tests hopefully into the final source code that you can grab in the description below. So here we are. What we need to do is we just need to get an instance of that database service. So I'm going to say private, and actually this is going to be, I think we're going to make this public. Final database, database service. Come on. And we're going to call this databases. And what I'm going to do is add a constructor parameter for this. And what this does, making this public now, is now when somebody creates, so again, we've created all this code on the Notion side. In my main package in dev.danvega.notiontalks, I'm going to create some code that allows me to say get all of my talks. So I can create an instance of the client, and then I can just say something like client.databases.query and pass in some kind of database ID, right? And so that's kind of the API that I'm looking for. And so that's why we're going to choose to do it this way. again, this can be up for debate. Again, I'm just trying to kind of mimic something I'm used to using. So we're going to roll with this for now, and we can always refactor this later. So that's all I need for the Notion client. That's all I think I need for the Notion package. Now let's go back into the main package, and we'll start to write the code that will actually allow us to pull the talk information from the database and display that. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this out. Now I'm going to create a new package inside of Notion Talks, and we'll call this controller. So this is going to be a new Java class. We'll call this talk controller. Inside of here, we're going to be creating a REST controller with a request mapping of /talks. And what we want to do in here is we want a simple get mapping. And this get mapping is going to return a list of something called a talk. We'll get back to this in a second. And we're going to find all, and let's return null. So that's what we need. Let's go ahead and create a class called talks. We're going to do this inside of a model controller. And this really doesn't need to be a class. I'm going to go ahead and turn this into a record, and this doesn't have much to it. This is going to have an ID for the talk, a title. Again, we're kind of matching up and lining up with those columns from the database, right? So we're saying I need an ID, I need a title, I need a local date, time for start date. I need a local date, time for end date. I need a URL, and I need a recording. So that's it. That is our, that's going to be our record that represents our talk. This is complaining. Now it's okay. So now what we want to do is we want to be able to get a list of talks back. So the first thing that we're going to need is that Notion client. So I'm going to come in here and say private final Notion client. Call this Notion client. Actually, let me just call that client. And we're going to need a constructor parameter for that. So we'll get this via dependency injection in Spring. We'll also need a Notion configuration properties because we're going to need stuff out of there. So now that we get this in here, what is this complaining about? Incorrect injection point, AutoWire and Spring Bean components options. Okay, we'll also need to add this as a constructor parameter. Okay, and this is complaining. Could not AutoWire, no beans of Notion client found. Okay, so if we go into here and we look at Notion client, oh yeah. So we need to mark this as a component, or Spring's not going to know that I need to go ahead and manage that. Same for database service. We need to come in here and say, hey, this is a service. Spring, go ahead and manage that for us. Okay, so that looks okay now. Okay, so now I should be able to come in here and say, I want to go ahead and from the client, I want to call the databases and I want to call query. And I need to get a database ID. So I can get that from Notion config properties.database ID. And so that should give us what we need. Let's extract this into a local variable. We'll call this pages. Now, the only thing that I think we're going to run into here is we probably want to take what's coming back here. So we have a list of pages, and we need to map everything that comes back from a page and turn it into a talk. So remember, the page in our Notion config has, Notion config page has all this information, but what we really care about is this information in the properties. And in the properties are all those columns. So we got to map those columns to a talk object, right? So we got to say for each of those, let's map those. So let's go ahead and I think I want to do this in, I think I want to move this to like a service. So let's go ahead and create a new package. We'll call this service. And inside this service, we'll call this Java class talk service. And actually, I think I want this talks service. Okay, so in here, I'm really just gonna have a single method for now. And this is going to allow me to basically map a page to a talk. So let's say this is a static method. We'll use this in a method reference come later. So let's say public static talk, and we're gonna map a page to a talk. And so we're gonna take in a page, and then we're gonna return a new talk, right? So this is what we're gonna have to do for whatever database that we're working with, because Notion is going to bring back that page. That page has dynamic content. And then for each of those, we're going to, that Notion package will work for any database, right? So we create another one, we can call that same code. But for each specific use case, we're going to have to map that into a specific instance. So the way that we do this now is, remember, the first thing we need is an ID. So we're going to call page.getID. The next thing we're going to need is the title. Now remember, the JSON for each of those columns was pretty convoluted. There was a lot of stuff going on in there. So this is going to look pretty funky. So first we need to get the properties, right? The properties is the dynamic portion. Then we need to start calling get by the actual key that we're trying to get. So the first one is title. But it's not just title, right? Remember I told you it was like, all right, we got to get the title, and then we got to get the title, and then that actually brings back an array. So we got to get the first element in the array, then we're going to get something called the text. Then we're going to go ahead and get the actual content out of there, and then we want to return that as text. So this is what I was saying as before, is to really understand the JSON structure, because this part gets a little tricky. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste some stuff in here so we don't have to watch me type all this, but this is what this ultimately ends up looking like. So we have the, I wonder why that's off. We have the ID. We have the title, start date, end date, URL, and then recording. And that should be that. So now we're returning a new talk. So this is really just so that we can do this in here. And we can come in here and say, okay, take that pages, turn it into a stream, and then go ahead and map each one of those. So I'm going to use the talk service, and we're going to use a method reference and say map page to talk for each of those, and then return a list. So that looks like it's working. Okay, I think we're okay. I think we're going to go ahead and try and test this. So let's go to our main application class and go ahead and run this. Well, first we'll see if it actually does run. Hey, it does. Cool. It started pretty quickly too. So let's head over to the browser and test this out. Okay, so here I am at localhost 8080. We're going to go to /talks. And we got an error. So let's check this out. So this is talking about a time, so a date, text 2022-6-7 could not be parsed at index 10. So let's go back to the browser. I believe this has to do with this. Yes. So we are looking for a local date time. We're trying to parse that into an actual time. So let's include the time. We are going to start at 8 a.m. and we are going to end at, I think, 5 p.m. So let's say 5 p.m. Oh, whoops. That was 8 o'clock both times. Sorry. So 8 a.m. Okay, so now we have a date time for each of those. Let's go ahead and try that again. And there we go. So now we have a list of talks. So each talk just contains the ID, the title, start date, end date, URL, and the recording. So we can see we have all these. So now we have an API that we can use on, say, a front end, whether it's a mobile app, a web app, whatever we're trying to do, some other microservice that needs to pull this information. We've stood up an endpoint that is now going to get the information from that Notion database. So pretty cool stuff if you ask me. You know, we really just kind of scratched the surface. We can do things like write back to Notion if we wanted to as well. I think the interesting bits here today, though, are this Notion package that we've created to kind of mimic that other JavaScript SDK. I really want to continue with this and build this out, and then maybe turn this into a starter so we can just kind of access that without having to have this kind of code here in our main package. So once we have that Notion code, again, all we did in our controller is say, hey, this is the database that I'm going to query. I know that's going to return me back a list of what a Notion calls a page. That page has a bunch of information on it. And then for each of the properties that come back, there are column, each of those properties are columns in that database. We need a way to turn that into whatever we're working with. So what we're working with here today is the idea of a talk. The talk is modeled around, it's a record that has just a few properties. And so we use our talk service to create a method that then just kind of maps each of those pages to a talk and then returns that list. So pretty cool stuff. Had a lot of fun building this out. I want to keep working on this. Like I said, there's a lot more that we can do here with the Notion SDK, writing tests against this stuff. There's so much more we can do. If you're interested in other content around this, let me know what you're building out with Notion. Let me know what I missed today. What else would you like to see from this? I'd be happy to kind of build that out. Again, two of my favorite things in the world right now, Notion and Spring. So I love kind of putting these two together and building out stuff. So, hey, if you found value in this video, you can help me out a lot by giving me a thumbs up below, leaving me a comment, as we just said, on anything that you'd like to see further on this topic, and by subscribing to the channel. Hey, if you're not a subscriber already, please subscribe. I love creating videos like this. Again, those things really help me out and help me get this content in front of a larger audience. So I hope you had a lot of fun today. I know I did. And as always, friends, happy coding.